This is a work of complete fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional and bear no resemblance to any real persons, places, or actual events. He didn't even lower his voice when he said it. Tanner Griggs stood on the dock her father had built board by board, his arm around Presley Nash like they were already home, and looked at Harper with the kind of flat, finished expression a man reserves for things he's already thrown away. "You're not my wife anymore," he said. "You don't belong here. Get off my property." Behind him, Presley smirked. The moving truck was already backing down the gravel drive. Harper's hand stopped shaking. Something older and quieter moved through her instead, the feeling of a door closing and another one opening. She reached into her jacket pocket, closed her fingers around the old brass key her father had pressed into her palm 20 years ago, and she walked inside her house and locked every door he owned. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly who this was made for. Hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments right now so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Stories like Harper's don't come along often. Stay with me. The drive up to Callaway Lake took 2 hours and 40 minutes, and Harper Doyle spent most of it with the radio off. She wasn't in the mood for music. She wasn't in the mood for talk shows or podcasts or any of the other things she used to fill silences with. She just drove, both hands on the wheel, watching the highway thin out into 2-lane roads and then into the kind of winding county route where the tree canopy closes overhead and you lose cell signal for miles at a stretch. She hadn't been to the lake house in 8 months. That was Tanner's doing, though she hadn't fully understood it at the time. He'd made it inconvenient, then uncomfortable, then quietly impossible. A conflict here, a commitment there. "You can go without me," he'd say, knowing full well she felt strange going alone now that her parents were gone. And then somehow she never went. And the months stacked up, and the lake house sat empty on Callaway's eastern shore like a held breath. She was going now because her neighbor, Dottie Marsh, had called her that morning from a number Harper almost didn't recognize. "I didn't know if I should call," Dottie had said, her voice carrying that particular discomfort of someone delivering bad news they'd been sitting on too long. "But there's a truck up here, Harper, a big one, and your husband is here with a woman I don't know, and they've been measuring things." "Measuring things," Harper repeated, "inside and out. She had a clipboard." Harper had stood in her kitchen in Atlanta for a long moment after that, coffee going cold in her hand, trying to locate the appropriate emotional response. What she found instead was something that had been building for so long she barely recognized it as anger anymore. It had calcified into something harder, something that didn't shake. She'd put the coffee down, picked up her keys and the manila folder her father's attorney had couriered to her 6 months ago, the one she'd read twice and then tucked into the fireproof box under her bed, and she drove north. The lake house sat on 2.5 acres at the end of a gravel road that Everett Doyle had maintained himself until his knees gave out at 71. Harper's father had built the main structure in the 1980s with a crew of 3 and a book of hand-drawn plans he'd drafted himself at the kitchen table over 2 winters. The dock extended 40 feet into the lake, the wood replaced in sections over the decades, but the original pilings still planted in the same muddy bottom her father had driven them into with a rented pile driver he'd learned to operate from a library manual. He'd been that kind of man, the kind who figured things out. Harper had inherited his stubbornness and his patience, and not much else he'd intended her to have so young. He'd died 6 years ago, her mother 3 years before that, and the lake house had become the one place on earth where Harper still felt their presence in any form that wasn't grief. The smell of the wood in summer, the particular sound of the screen door, the way the light moved across the water at 5 in the afternoon when the wind dropped. She hadn't told Tanner any of that. She'd tried, early on, and he'd listened with the expression of a man enduring someone else's emotional weather. After a while, she stopped trying. Some things you learn to carry alone. She turned off the county road onto the gravel drive at 12:30. The crunch under her tires was familiar. The large white box truck parked sideways across the upper yard was not. She pulled up behind her own car, or rather, behind a car she didn't recognize, a gunmetal gray SUV with a dealership plate still on it, and cut the engine. Sat for a moment. Breathed. Then she got out. She heard them before she saw them, voices from the direction of the water. Tanner's voice, lower than she remembered, or maybe just more comfortable, the way a voice gets when it's not performing anything. And a woman's voice, higher, carrying a particular note of proprietary enthusiasm that Harper had only ever heard from people describing things they'd already decided to own. She walked around the side of the house. The old hydrangeas her mother had planted along the foundation were starting to show their summer bloom, pale blue clusters she hadn't seen in 8 months. And she noticed this without quite being able to process it, because at the end of the dock, framed by the open lake and the flat white sky, Tanner Griggs stood with his arm around a woman Harper had seen exactly twice before. Presley Nash, 29 years old, associate at the architectural firm that had begun consulting with Tanner's development company 18 months ago. Harper had met her at a company dinner and found her unremarkable, which she now understood was its own kind of blindness. Presley was holding a clipboard. She was wearing one of those effortful casual outfits that take money to look like they don't. She was leaning into Tanner's side in a way that was so familiar, so practiced, that Harper's stomach registered it before her brain did. Tanner saw her first. His face went through several things in quick succession: surprise, irritation, a kind of rapid recalculation, and then settled into something flat and controlled. Harper. Tanner. She kept walking. Steady pace down the slope toward the dock. What is this? I could ask you the same thing. I didn't know you were coming up. No, she said. I imagine you didn't. She was on the dock now. The boards were warm under her shoes, the lake smell rising around her the way it always did, mineral and faintly green, and her hands were completely still at her sides. Presley had taken her arm off Tanner's waist. She was watching Harper with an expression that tried to be neutral and landed somewhere closer to impatient. Harper, Tanner said, and his voice had shifted into the tone she knew, the careful, slightly elevated tone he used when he was managing a situation. This isn't really a good time. It isn't a good time, she repeated, for me to be at my family's property. We're in the middle of something. I can see that. She looked at the clipboard in Presley's hands, looked at the measuring tape clipped to Tanner's belt, looked at the small stack of papers held down on the dock railing by a rock she recognized, a flat piece of pink granite her father had brought back from a camping trip in North Carolina in 1991 and used as a paperweight for 30 years. What are you measuring? Tanner put his hands in his pockets. It was a gesture she'd seen 1,000 times, the body language of a man who had decided to be patient with someone he no longer respected. The shoreline, he said, the dock dimensions, the square footage of the structure. We're doing preliminary assessments. Preliminary assessments, Harper said. For what? He held her gaze. Didn't answer immediately. In the silence, a loon called from somewhere across the water, and the dock rocked barely perceptibly as a motorboat passed somewhere distant. For development purposes, he said finally. The words landed strangely. Not like a shock, more like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into a shape she'd been looking at wrong for years, and now could suddenly see correctly. You're planning to develop Callaway Lake, she said. The eastern shore has significant commercial potential. The trust holding this parcel is obscure, the zoning variance is achievable, and the market timing. Tanner, she said it quietly. Stop. He stopped. Not because she'd asked him to. Because there was something in her voice that made him hesitate, and she saw it. The flicker of recalibration, the brief uncertainty, before he covered it. Look, he said, and now his voice dropped into something almost kind, which was how she knew she should be most careful. I understand this is hard. The emotional attachment to this place is real, and I respect that. But we need to have a practical conversation about the property going forward, especially given everything. Given the divorce, she said. A pause. Yes, he said. Given the divorce. She nodded slowly. She hadn't agreed to the divorce. That was the thing. She'd received his attorney's letter 11 days ago and hadn't responded yet, not because she was devastated. She'd arrived at the shore of that particular ocean months ago and had already walked through it, but because she'd been waiting to understand what he actually wanted. And now she understood. He didn't want the marriage. He'd never particularly wanted the marriage, she suspected, not in any way that required him to actually show up for another person. What Tanner Griggs had wanted was the access, the stability, the social camouflage of a steady marriage while he assembled the pieces of something else. And now he'd moved on to the next phase, and Harper's family's lakehouse was in the way, And so was Harper. We were married for 15 years, she said. Yes. And in 15 years you came here with me 4 times. I counted once. Harper, you said the drive was too long. You said the house was drafty. You said the dock needed work and it wasn't worth the cost. You said, she stopped herself, breathed. You said a lot of things. Tanner's jaw shifted. What's your point? My point, she said, is that you're standing on a dock you've stood on 4 times in 15 years, with a woman who has a clipboard, measuring my father's property for a development project you apparently decided to pursue without mentioning it to me, and calling this a practical conversation. Presley cleared her throat lightly. Tanner glanced at her. Something passed between them, the shorthand of people who've been communicating privately for a long time. And when Tanner looked back at Harper, something in his posture had hardened. You and I are done, Harper, he said. That's not a conversation anymore, it's a fact. The attorneys will handle the division of marital assets, and this property is going to be part of that conversation, whether you're ready for it or not. Is that right? You don't have the resources to maintain this place independently. You don't have the income. You haven't worked in 3 years. I worked. I managed my parents' estate, the trust administration, You didn't earn a salary, he said. And in the settlement, that's what matters. She looked at him, at the absolute confidence of him, the certainty that he had already done the math and the math came out in his favor. Can I ask you something? She said. He waited. Do you think this place belongs to you? I think it's a marital asset that's not what I asked. Her voice was still quiet, not shaking, not performative. Just quiet in the way that things are quiet when they've settled. Do you think this property is yours? Tanner glanced at Presley again, then back at Harper. And then he said something that she would think about later, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted clarity. He said it without raising his voice, which almost made it worse. You're not my wife anymore, Harper. You stopped being my wife a long time ago. And right now you are standing on property that is going to be subject to legal proceedings whether you cooperate or not. So I'm asking you, very reasonably, to step aside and let us finish what we're doing. Then he looked at her the way you look at something that used to mean something and doesn't anymore. Actually, he said, I'm going to need you to leave. The loon called again across the water. Harper stood on her father's dock for 5 seconds that felt like they had physical weight to them. She could feel the boards under her feet. She could feel the key in her jacket pocket, the same jacket she'd been wearing when Dottie called, when she'd grabbed it off the hook by the door without thinking. Her mother's old hydrangeas were blooming along the foundation behind her. The pink granite paperweight her father had carried home from the mountains sat on the railing 6 inches from her left hand. She reached out and picked it up, held it for a moment, set it in her own pocket. Tanner frowned. Harper, I'm not leaving, she said. She turned and walked back up the dock, walked up the slope, walked around to the front door of the house her father built. She put the brass key in the lock, turned it, stepped inside. The house smelled like cedar and old wood and the ghost of her mother's cooking, some combination of things she couldn't name individually but recognized instantly as home. And she stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the familiar silence, the way the walls held sound. Then she locked the front door from the inside, walked to the back door, locked that, walked to the side entrance off the mudroom, locked that, walked to the door that led from the kitchen to the side porch, locked that too. She heard Tanner's voice outside, first bemused, then louder, then sharp, with a particular quality she recognized as the tone he used when he was genuinely caught off guard and didn't like it. She heard Presley say something she couldn't make out. She heard the screen door she hadn't locked yet rattle in its frame. She went and locked the screen door. Then she stood in her father's kitchen, her back to the door, her hands finally not quite still, and she pressed them flat against the counter. The same laminate counter she'd leaned against 1,000 times as a child while her mother stood at the stove. The same counter her father had patched in 3 places over the years rather than replaced because he said it still worked fine. It just needed tending to. Outside, Tanner's voice climbed another register. Harper, open this door right now. Harper, I am not kidding. She looked out the kitchen window at the lake, at the way the afternoon light was already starting to work on the water, that early shimmer that would build over the next few hours into something magnificent. She hadn't been here in 8 months, and she had actually forgotten how the lake looked in early summer. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, found the number her father's attorney had given her, Margaret Chu, Estate and Trust Law, Asheville, and pressed call. "Ms. Chu," she said when the assistant put her through, "this is Harper Doyle. I'm at the Callaway Lake property, and I have a situation I need your help clarifying. Specifically, regarding the Doyle Family Preservation Trust, and what authority, if any, my husband has over this property in the context of our pending divorce." There was a brief pause. "Mrs. Doyle," Margaret Chu said, "I'm very glad you called. I've been waiting to hear from you." Outside, a fist struck the back door 3 times, hard. "Harper." Tanner's voice through the door was controlled now, which was its own kind of warning. "This isn't going to go the way you think it's going to go." She pressed the phone more firmly to her ear. "What can you tell me about the trust structure?" she said. "Specifically, who holds legal decision-making authority over the land itself?" Margaret Chu said, "You do, solely and entirely. The trust documents your father executed are quite specific. The property cannot be included in any marital estate proceeding, cannot be liened, transferred, or developed without the sole authorization of the named trust administrator. Which is me. Which is you." Harper looked at the wall where her father had hung a framed photograph she'd taken herself at 16. The dock at dawn, the lake flat and silver, the light just starting to break over the tree line on the far shore. It was a bad photograph, technically. She'd cut off part of the dock and the horizon tilted slightly. He'd hung it anyway because she'd taken it. "Thank you," she said to Margaret Chu. "I'll need you to send a formal letter to my husband's attorneys by end of business today. I'll also need guidance on the process for formally revoking any access he may have attempted to claim informally." "Already drafted," Margaret Chu said. "I was waiting for your authorization." Tanner hit the door again. "Harper, there is a legal process here, and you don't get to just—" She walked to the back door, pressed her palm against the wood, didn't open it. "There is a legal process," she said. "You're right about that." Her voice was loud enough to carry through the door. She hadn't raised it. "And when you talk to your attorney tonight, ask him about the Doyle Family Preservation Trust. Ask him what the property transfer restrictions are. Ask him what authority you actually have here." Silence on the other side of the door. Then Tanner's voice, lower. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that this house, this dock, and the land it sits on have never been a marital asset, Tanner. Not for 15 years, not for a single day. My father made sure of that long before I married you. I just didn't think I'd need to use it." Another silence. Longer this time. Then Presley's voice, barely audible. "Tanner." Then nothing. The sound of gravel shifting under footsteps. The distant thunk of the SUV door. The engine turning over. Harper stood in her father's kitchen and listened to the truck back down the driveway. Listened to the sound of 2 vehicles on gravel, diminishing, going. Listened to the silence that came back when they were gone. The particular silence of a house that has weathered something and is still standing. She put her phone down on the counter. Went to the refrigerator, which was empty but cold, humming its familiar, slightly uneven hum. Closed it again. Went to the window over the sink and looked at the lake. The afternoon light was doing what it always did at this hour, moving across the water in long, oblique patterns that changed while you watched them. The dock sat at the end of its familiar path down the slope, 40 feet of boards over the same pilings her father had driven into the same lake bottom in 1987. She needed to inspect the wood. She'd need to call someone about the structural integrity of the far end. She'd need to stock the refrigerator, open the windows, clear the gutters, figure out what kind of shape the place was in after 8 months closed. There was a great deal to do. She stood at the window and gave herself another 30 seconds to simply breathe, looking at the lake her father had loved enough to protect with every legal instrument available to him. Then she picked up her phone and called Dottie Marsh. "I'm here," she said when Dottie picked up. "I saw the trucks leave," Dottie said. "You okay?" Harper thought about the question. It was a real question, not a social one, and it deserved a real answer. "I think so," she said. "I think I'm actually okay." "You need anything? I've got a pot of soup on." "Give me an hour," Harper said. "I want to walk the property first." She hung up. Found the spare key ring on the hook by the back door. Her father's keys. The full set. Every door and gate and storage shed on the property, labeled in his particular cramped handwriting on small rectangles of masking tape. She put them in her pocket alongside the old brass key and the pink granite stone. Then she unlocked the back door and stepped out onto the porch, into the smell of the lake and the sound of the water and the warmth of the afternoon light, and she started walking. Dottie Marsh had been Harper's nearest neighbor at Callaway Lake for going on 32 years, which meant she had known Everett Doyle when he still had most of his hair, had attended Harper's mother's funeral in the small cemetery off Route 9, and had watched Harper grow from a knock-kneed girl who spent summers catching crawdads off the dock into a composed, careful woman who had, in Dottie's private assessment, spent the last decade making herself smaller than she was. She brought the soup anyway, a big pot of vegetable beef that she carried across the quarter-mile of Lake Road between their properties at 4:30, moving slowly because her hip had been giving her trouble since March. And she wasn't going to admit that to anyone who might use it as an excuse to worry about her. Harper met her at the door. She'd changed out of her city clothes into an old flannel shirt she'd apparently found somewhere in the house, her father's, by the look of it, worn through at the left elbow. And her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she'd done it quickly and without much thought. She looked like herself, Dottie thought, more than she had in a long time. "You didn't have to do that," Harper said. "The soup was already made." Dottie handed over the pot and stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which was her established practice. "How bad was it?" "I'll tell you over soup." They sat at the kitchen table, the same round table with the uneven leg that Everett had fixed 3 times and never fixed properly, and Harper told her most of it. Not the legal details, she was still sorting those out herself, but the substance of it. Tanner on the dock, Presley with the clipboard, the measuring tape and the preliminary assessments, and the moment when he'd looked at her and said the words she'd been watching him build toward for longer than she'd admitted to herself. Dottie listened without interrupting, which she was not always good at. "The woman had a clipboard," she said when Harper finished. "She did." "On your father's dock?" "On my father's dock." Dottie put her spoon down. She had an opinion about this, several, actually, and she chose the most restrained one. "How long has that been going on?" Harper looked at her soup. "I'm not sure exactly. Long enough that it was practiced. The way they stood together. It wasn't new." "Did you know? Before today?" Harper thought about it honestly. "I suspected. About 6 months ago I found a message on his phone that I wasn't meant to see. He explained it away and I let him, which I think tells you more about where we were than the message itself." "What did the message say?" "It said, 'Last night was worth every complication.'" Dottie picked her spoon back up. "Well," she said, "yeah." "And the property? You said something to him through the door. He left right after." Harper got up and went to the counter where she'd left the manila folder, brought it back to the table and opened it, though she didn't need to. She'd read it enough times to recite it. "My father set this up 8 years ago, about 2 years after my mother died, and around the same time Tanner and I started having real problems, which I don't think was a coincidence. He never said so directly. He wasn't a man who said things directly, but he restructured the estate, created the Doyle Family Preservation Trust, and designated me sole administrator with a list of restrictions on the property that essentially make it untouchable in any marital or creditor proceeding. Your father was a smart man." "He was." Harper closed the folder. "He was also a man who paid close attention, and I think he paid close attention to Tanner and didn't like what he saw, and this was how he dealt with it, quietly, in advance, without making a scene." "That sounds like him." Harper nodded. It did sound like him. It sounded exactly like him, and sitting in his kitchen with her hands around a bowl of borrowed soup, she felt the specific grief of missing someone who had understood you well enough to protect you from things you hadn't yet admitted you needed protecting from. "Has your attorney been in touch with his attorneys?" Dottie asked. "She's sending the letter tonight. I'll hear something by tomorrow." Harper looked at the table. "He's going to be angry. He's already angry. Angrier. When he realizes the scope of it, not just the house, but what the trust covers, the acreage, the shoreline rights, he's going to escalate." She paused. "That's usually what he does when something doesn't go the way he planned. He escalates." Dottie considered this. "And what do you do when he escalates?" Harper looked at her across the table. "I'm still figuring that out." It was an honest answer. Dottie respected it. They finished the soup. Dottie went home before dark because the hip genuinely was bad, and she wasn't walking that road in the evening. Harper washed the bowls and set them to dry, and stood at the kitchen window as the light left the lake by degrees, going from gold to copper to the deep, unreflective blue of early night. She'd called her sister that afternoon. Meredith lived in Portland now, had for 12 years, and their relationship had that particular texture of siblings who love each other and rarely know what to say. Meredith had been kind on the phone and deeply unsurprised about Tanner, which Harper had found obscurely comforting, the confirmation that she hadn't been as invisible in her unhappiness as she'd felt. "Come stay with me," Meredith had said, "even for a week." "I can't. I need to be here right now." "Harper, I'm okay, Mer. I'm genuinely okay." She'd said it twice in one day now, and was starting to believe it, which struck her as significant. She slept that night in her old childhood bedroom, in the twin bed her father had never replaced because no one had asked him to, under the same quilt her mother had made from scraps of old flannel shirts. She lay on her back in the dark, listening to the lake sounds she'd grown up with. The creak of the dock in the water, the occasional lap of something disturbing the surface, the tree frogs that started up around 10 and ran until well past midnight. And she thought about Tanner standing on that dock, not with the anger she'd expected to feel when she rehearsed this moment in her head, more with a kind of sad, clear-eyed assessment. 15 years was a long time to spend with someone. You learned their habits and their rhythms and the particular sound of their silences. You made accommodations that became so normalized you forgot they were accommodations. You negotiated yourself down, a percentage point at a time, until one day you stood on your father's dock and your husband looked at you like something he'd already dealt with, and you realized you'd let yourself become exactly that small. Not entirely his fault. That was the uncomfortable part. She'd participated in her own diminishment, out of some combination of conflict avoidance and misplaced loyalty and the specific fear of being alone that she'd never quite been honest about. She wasn't a passive victim in the story of her marriage. She was a person who'd made choices, and some of those choices had been bad ones, and now she was in the kitchen of her father's lakehouse at midnight, starting over. That was the accurate version. She was going to try to keep holding the accurate version. She fell asleep eventually. The tree frogs were still going. Tanner called at 7:15 the next morning. She was on the porch with coffee, watching a pair of herons work the shallow water near the dock, when her phone lit up with his name. She let it ring through to voicemail. He called again immediately, which was characteristic, and she let that one go too. Then he sent a text. "We need to talk. My attorney is going to contact yours today. I need you to understand the position you're putting yourself in." She read it twice, put the phone face down on the porch railing, and watched the herons. The position she was putting herself in. There it was. The framing she'd been waiting for, the reorientation of events that would cast her as the problem. She'd anticipated it. Tanner was not an unintelligent man. He understood narrative, understood how to construct one, had spent the better part of their marriage constructing narratives in which his needs were reasonable and hers were sentimental obstacles. He was good at it. She'd fallen for it repeatedly. She wouldn't fall for it now. But she'd also learned, over 15 years, that the way to deal with Tanner's escalation was not to match it. You matched his energy, and he simply increased his own. The only thing that had ever actually stopped him was something he hadn't anticipated, like discovering that the property he'd been planning to develop was legally inviolable and always had been. She picked up her phone and texted Margaret Chu instead. "He called this morning. I didn't answer. Let me know when you've heard from his team." Then she went inside and made breakfast. The attorney's letter reached Tanner's lawyers, according to Margaret, at 8:52 that morning. By 11, she had their response. Harper was walking the back half of the property, the 2 acres of mixed woodland that her father had let grow wild, tending it selectively rather than clearing it, when Margaret called. "They're contesting the trust structure," Margaret said, "or trying to. They're arguing that because you've resided in the property intermittently and it has been treated as a shared marital asset in practice." "It hasn't been," Harper said. "He's been here 4 times in 15 years. "I know. Their argument is thin. They know it's thin. What they're hoping is that the legal challenge is expensive enough and protracted enough that you'll negotiate rather than fight." Harper stopped walking. She was at the edge of the woodland, looking at the lake from the back angle, through a break in the trees where her father had cleared a narrow path to a second dock he'd never gotten around to building. "How expensive is fighting going to be?" she asked. "Significant. Not ruinous, but significant." "And what's our position, actually?" "Extremely strong. Your father worked with an excellent attorney when he drafted this. The trust is airtight. What they're doing is throwing procedural weight at it, hoping something creates enough friction that you compromise. Standard practice when you have a weak case and resources. And he has resources. More than you currently. That's their calculation. Harper looked at the lake, her father's second dock path. The birch trees he'd planted along the edge of the clearing in the late 90s, now fully grown and starting to shade out the grass below them. "I'm not going to compromise," she said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I want to be sure you understand what that means in the short term. It means it's going to be hard and expensive, and he's going to make me miserable while it's happening." "More or less?" "Okay," Harper said. "I've been more or less miserable for 6 years. At least this version is on my own terms." Margaret made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "All right, then I'll respond accordingly. There's one more thing, though, that I think you need to know." Harper waited. His development company has already filed for a preliminary zoning variance on the eastern shoreline. The county planning office received the application 3 weeks ago. He didn't need your signature for the application itself. That would only come if the variance were approved and proceeded to transfer. But it means he started this process long before yesterday. The tree frogs. The lake in the dark. 15 years of Sunday mornings and family Christmases, and the particular way he'd looked at her across rooms at parties, with a fondness she'd mistaken for love, and was now understanding had been the comfortable satisfaction of a man whose arrangements were all in order. "He came here to assess a property he'd already filed for," she said. "It appears so." And Presley, the architectural firm she works for, is a consulting partner on his development company's Eastern Shoreline project. "Yes, we found that this morning." Harper stood in the birch trees for a long moment. The lake was visible in pieces through the trunks, broken and glinting. "Margaret," she said, "I want to understand everything, the full scope of what he's filed for, what the variance would cover, what approvals he'd still need. Can you get me all of that?" "It's already in progress. I'll have a full briefing for you by tomorrow." She hung up and stood in the trees a while longer. Not angry, exactly. Or not only angry. There was also something else. The slowly clarifying recognition of a person who has been lied to for a long time and is only now seeing the full architecture of it. The particular cold lucidity of that. The way it makes everything that came before arrange itself into a different pattern. She walked back to the house, changed her shoes, got in her car. She drove to the county planning office. The Millhaven County Planning Department occupied a low building near the courthouse that smelled of old paper and institutional carpet cleaner, and had the particular energy of a place staffed by people who had developed strong opinions about zoning regulations over many years. Harper had been in this office twice in her life. Once as a teenager with her father when he'd dealt with a boundary dispute with the neighboring lot, and once in her 30s when she'd filed the trust documentation herself. The woman at the front desk had the name tag Carol and the expression of someone who had processed too many variance applications to be impressed by any particular one. "I'm looking for information on a pending variance application," Harper said, "for the eastern shoreline of Callaway Lake, filed approximately 3 weeks ago." Carol typed without much urgency. "Name of the applicant?" "Griggs Development Group." More typing. A pause. "I can show you what's on public record. The application itself, the project description, the preliminary materials." She peered at her screen. "This is a fairly substantial filing. Mixed-use commercial waterfront development. 42 units of short-term rental accommodation, a marina expansion, a restaurant and event facility." Harper gripped the edge of the counter, kept her voice level. "And the affected parcels?" Carol read them off. There were 7 parcels listed on the eastern shoreline. The Doyle family trust parcel was third on the list. "These 7 parcels," Harper said, "were the owners notified?" "Adjoining property owners would receive notification once the variance moves to the public comment phase, which would be," Carol checked her screen, "scheduled for next month." "Next month." "The 15th. There's a public hearing. Anyone with a stake in the affected area can submit comment or appear in person." Harper looked at the application summary Carol had printed for her. 42 short-term rental units, a marina, a restaurant and event facility. The eastern shoreline of Callaway Lake, which had been mostly residential and quiet for 60 years, turned into what would essentially be a commercial resort. Her father had spent the last years of his life quietly, patiently, legally, making sure that could not happen to the land he owned. She was starting to understand that he'd also known, had watched from his porch and his dock and his conversations at the county planning office, that the pressure would come eventually, that someone would want the eastern shoreline, that the only thing standing between the lake and that particular future would be whoever held the trust. "Can I get a full copy of the application?" she asked. "I can print it," Carol said. "It's 48 pages. "Please," she sat in a plastic chair near the window while the printer worked. A man in muddy work boots came in and argued with a different clerk about a setback requirement on a garage addition. A teenager in a county uniform brought a stack of folders from the back and dropped them on a desk. The industrial fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. Harper looked at the pages as they came off the printer. Architectural renderings, site maps, projected traffic studies, economic impact summaries, the kind of professional thoroughness that indicated significant investment in time, in money, in planning. This wasn't something that had been assembled in a few weeks. This had been in development for the better part of a year, maybe longer, while she was married to him, while she was attending company dinners and meeting Presley Nash and registering her as a pleasant, unremarkable presence at a table, while she was driving to this same lake 4 times a year alone and wondering why the marriage felt like it had an air leak she couldn't locate. She paid for the copies. 48 pages. Outside, she sat in her car and called her sister. "I found out why he wanted the house," she said. Meredith was quiet for a moment. "Tell me." She told her. All of it. The development application, the timeline, the architectural renderings of a 42-unit waterfront resort on the eastern shore of Callaway Lake. Her voice stayed flat while she said it, the way her voice had been going flat on and off since yesterday. A kind of circuit breaker response that she recognized from the worst stretches of her marriage. "He's been planning this for a year," Meredith said. "At least." "While you were still married." "While we were still married." Harper looked through the windshield at the planning office building. He needed the Doyle parcel for the development to work. It's the anchor of the shoreline stretch. It has the most frontage, the best dock access. Without it, the resort layout doesn't work. He needed the parcel, and the easiest way to get it was through the divorce settlement. Except Dad protected it. Except Dad protected it. A long silence. "Harper," Meredith said finally, "what are you going to do?" "I'm going to go to the public hearing on the 15th. She started the car. "And I'm going to be very well prepared when I do." She spent the next 3 days at the lakehouse learning things she hadn't known she didn't know. She started with her father's files. He'd kept meticulous records in a filing cabinet in the small office off the main bedroom. Property surveys, water quality assessments going back to the 1970s, correspondence with the county about shoreline preservation, minutes from the Callaway Lake Property Owners Association going back 15 years. Harper had known abstractly that her father was engaged in the community around the lake. She hadn't known the scope of it. He'd been part of a group, informal, never incorporated, just a collection of neighbors who'd been meeting over coffee for years, that had spent the better part of a decade working to have the eastern shoreline designated as a conservation-adjacent zone. They'd never quite gotten there. The county planning board had been sympathetic but non-committal. The politics were complicated, the interests competing, and her father had died before the effort reached a resolution. But his files also contained something she hadn't expected to find, a thick folder of correspondence with a man named Walter Fenn, who turned out to be a land use attorney in Mill Haven who had been quietly, without fanfare, building a legal case for the shoreline preservation designation for the better part of 8 years. Harper called Walter Fenn on a Tuesday morning from the dock, sitting in the old aluminum chair her father had kept chained to the dock post since the 90s, watching the herons. He picked up on the second ring. "I know who you are," he said when she introduced herself. "Your father told me you'd call eventually. He said it might take a while." "He said I'd call?" He said, "My daughter will figure it out. She always takes a little while to trust what she already knows, but she gets there." A pause. "Those were his words. I wrote them down because I intended to give them to you when the time came." Harper stared at the lake. Felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. "He knew about the development plans?" she said. "Not specifically. Not these specific plans. But he understood the trajectory. He understood what the eastern shoreline would look like to a certain kind of investor once the right infrastructure was in place, and he understood that the only thing that would stop it was a combination of legal protection and someone who cared enough to show up and use it. Another pause. He was very clear about which part he'd handled and which part he was leaving to you. She sat on the dock in the afternoon light for a long moment before she could speak again. The water moved under the boards in that familiar, barely perceptible way, the whole dock rocking on a frequency she felt more than heard. "What do we need for the hearing?" she asked. "I have 8 years of documentation," Walter Fenn said. "Environmental assessments, water quality data, precedent from similar shoreline preservation cases. What I need from you is the trust documentation, which I understand is solid, and the authorization to file as a formal objection to the variance on preservation grounds." "You have that authorization," she said, "as of right now." "Then we're in good shape," Walter said. "Not comfortable shape. He's going to have well-funded opposition at that hearing, but good shape." Harper looked at the far shore of the lake, the tree line, the way the water caught the light in the afternoon. "My father used to say that good shape was enough if you were willing to do the work," she said. "He said that to me too," Walter replied, "more than once." She stayed on the dock after the call ended, not moving, her hands loose in her lap. The old aluminum chair creaked once under her. A motorboat passed in the middle distance, its wake reaching the dock a minute later as a small, rhythmic rocking, and then the lake settled again. Tanner had sent 2 more texts since the morning call. She hadn't answered them. His attorney had sent Margaret a formal response that used the word reasonable 7 times, which Margaret said was a reliable indicator of a party that knew their position was not reasonable. There would be more. There would be a sustained campaign of formal letters and informal pressure and the particular kind of social messaging that Tanner was skilled at. The suggestion, communicated through mutual acquaintances, that Harper was being difficult, that she was letting grief about her father cloud her judgment, that she was making this harder than it needed to be. She was making this exactly as hard as it needed to be. That was the new thing she was holding on to, not as revenge, not out of bitterness, just as a factual assessment of what protecting this land and this legacy actually required. Her father had sat on this same dock in this same aluminum chair and understood that, had spent the last years of his life building the quiet infrastructure of protection that she was now standing inside. She reached into her pocket and found the pink granite paperweight, held it in her palm. It was warm from the sun. The hearing was in 11 days. She had a great deal to do. She got up from the chair and went back to the house. The 11 days before the public hearing were not peaceful, and Harper hadn't expected them to be. Tanner's attorney, a man named Clifford Brace, who had a reputation in Atlanta real estate circles for being expensive and effective and not particularly troubled by the ethical texture of his work, sent 3 formal letters in the first week alone. The first reiterated the claim that the Doyle Family Preservation Trust contained structural irregularities that rendered it challengeable in a marital asset proceeding. The second introduced the argument that Harper had, through years of cohabitation and shared financial decision-making, effectively waived any separate property protection the trust might otherwise have provided. The third was shorter and more direct. It noted that Griggs Development Group's variance application was proceeding on schedule, that the Doyle parcel was not legally necessary for the first phase of the project, and that Harper would be well advised to consider a negotiated settlement before the hearing made everything public and complicated. Margaret Chu responded to all 3 with what she described to Harper as the legal equivalent of a closed door. Short, precise, and giving nothing. "He's testing," Margaret said over the phone. "He wants to see if any of it rattles you enough to call him." "It doesn't," Harper said. "Good. Don't call him." She wasn't tempted to call him. What she was doing instead, for most of those 11 days, was working. She went through her father's files with the thoroughness of someone who understood, finally, what they were looking at. She photographed documents and emailed them to Walter Fenn. She drove to the county library and spent 2 afternoons in the local history archive pulling records on Callaway Lake going back to the 1940s. Development proposals that had been floated and rejected, water quality studies, the original conservation assessment that a state agency had conducted in 1978 and then apparently never followed up on. She talked to neighbors, not just Dottie, though Dottie was a constant presence, appearing at the lakehouse with food and opinions on a near-daily basis. But the other families on the Eastern Shore who had received the variance notification and were variously alarmed, confused, or in a few cases grimly unsurprised. The Pellegrino family, 2 properties down, had 3 generations using their lake house. Ray Pellegrino, who was 74 and had the posture of a man who'd spent 40 years doing physical work and hadn't entirely stopped, sat with Harper on his back porch and told her he'd been watching the pressure on the Eastern Shore build for years. "They came to me 2 years ago," he said. "Different company, same idea. I told them I wasn't selling. They went away." He paused. "Thought that was the end of it." "It wasn't," Harper said. "No, I can see that." He looked at the lake. His property had a longer shoreline than hers. The Pellegrino lot was wider, with a natural inlet that gave it protected water for swimming. "You said your husband's company filed this?" "Yes." Ray turned and looked at her with the kind of direct, uncomplicated appraisal that older men of his particular generation sometimes had. Not unkind, just undecorated. "Your father was a good man," he said. "He would have hated this." "He anticipated it," Harper said. "That's what I'm learning." Everett was like that, and thought about things a long time before he acted. Ray was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me?" "Your presence at the hearing, your testimony if you're willing, and anything you have in writing from that approach 2 years ago. If they sent letters, made offers, anything on paper." Ray nodded slowly. "I've got letters. Kept everything. Couldn't tell you exactly why at the time, just seemed like the kind of thing you keep." "It was," Harper said. "It really was." She left his porch with a folder of correspondence between the Pellegrino family and a company called Lakeview Capital Partners, which turned out, when Walter Fenn ran the name through his databases, to be a subsidiary of Griggs Development Group operating under a different name, 2 years ago. While she and Tanner were still attending dinner parties together, and she was still trying to diagnose the specific quality of the distance between them. She didn't call Tanner. She added the folder to the growing file on her father's desk. Marlene Griggs called on a Thursday morning, 6 days before the hearing. Harper almost didn't answer. She looked at the name on the screen for 3 full rings, weighing it. Tanner's mother was not a person she had ever been comfortable with. A small, precise woman of 70 who had strong opinions about most things and expressed them in a particular way that always felt like a test, Harper was perpetually on the verge of failing. Their relationship over 15 years had been cordial in the way of 2 people who have agreed not to address the central tension between them. She answered. "Harper." Marlene's voice was exactly as she remembered it, controlled, slightly clipped, with the faintest southern inflection she'd been filing down for decades. "I'd like to meet with you. In person." "Why?" Harper asked. Not rudely, just directly. A short silence. "Because I think this situation has gone further than it needed to, and I'd like to talk to you. If this is about the variance or the divorce proceedings, it's not about the legal side. That's between the attorneys." Another pause. "I want to talk to you about Tanner." Harper looked out the kitchen window. One of the herons was back, standing in the shallows near the dock, with the motionless patience of something that had learned to wait as a survival strategy. "Okay," she said, "but I'm at the lake. You'd have to come here." A very brief hesitation. Fine. Saturday." Marlene arrived on Saturday morning in a silver sedan that she parked with precision in the upper yard. She was dressed the way she always dressed. Neat slacks, a pressed blouse, low heels that made no sense for a gravel driveway, but that she wore anyway because she'd been wearing that particular kind of shoe since 1975. And wasn't going to stop on anyone's account. She looked older than the last time Harper had seen her, at a company event 8 months ago. Or maybe Harper was just looking more carefully. They sat on the front porch because it was a decent morning and the kitchen felt too intimate for whatever this was. Harper made coffee. Marlene accepted a cup and held it without drinking much. "You look like you've been sleeping," Marlene said, which, from Marlene, was a form of compliment, the implication being that she'd expected otherwise. "I've been working," Harper said. "It helps." Marlene looked out at the yard, the hydrangeas, the slope down to the lake. "I haven't been here since your father's funeral," she said. "I know." "It's a beautiful piece of land," said without particular warmth, but also without the subtle deprecation Harper had grown accustomed to from her on the subject of the lake house. Just a factual observation. It is, Harper said. Marlene set her cup on the porch railing. He's going to hurt you with this if you let him, she said. Financially, publicly. He has resources and he has Clifford Brace and he has… She stopped. He has a particular way of not letting things go when he feels cornered. I know that, Harper said. I was married to him for 15 years. Then you know this isn't going to be quick or clean. I do. Marlene looked at her directly for the first time since she'd sat down. She had Tanner's eyes, or rather, Tanner had hers, the same shade of gray-green that could go either warm or cold, depending on what the person behind them decided. I'm not here to ask you to back down, she said. I want to be clear about that. Harper hadn't expected that. She waited. I'm here because… Marlene picked up her coffee cup again, looked at it, put it down. The gesture of a woman choosing her words. My son has done something wrong. He has done several things wrong, and I am not able to fix them, and I wouldn't insult you by trying. A pause. But I know how he operates, and I know how Clifford operates, and I want you to understand one thing they will do that you might not be prepared for. Tell me. They will try to make this about you, about your emotional state, your attachment to this property, whether grief for your parents has affected your judgment. They will build a picture of a woman who is irrational and acting from loss rather than legal standing. Marlene's voice was flat and precise. They will do this at the hearing. They will do it in any proceeding that becomes public. It is a specific strategy and it works more often than it should. Harper looked at Tanner's mother. At this contained, complicated woman who had spent 40 years constructing a careful persona and who was sitting on her porch telling her something she didn't have to tell her. Why are you warning me? Harper asked. The question hung there for a moment. Because I watched your father sit in this yard, Marlene said finally, and he was a better man than my son turned out to be, and I'm sorry about that. She picked up her coffee and actually drank some of it. And because when this is over, however it ends, I'd rather not have been the person who said nothing. They sat in a silence that was uncomfortable and also, strangely, not hostile. What do you think of Presley Nash? Harper asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. It came out anyway. Marlene's expression did something complicated. I think she's 29 years old and she doesn't know my son yet, she said. She will. That's not an answer. No, Marlene agreed. It isn't. She stood up, set her cup on the railing. Thank you for the coffee. She drove back down the gravel road in the silver sedan, and Harper watched her go, and then sat on the porch for a long time afterward, turning the conversation over in her mind. Marlene hadn't come to help her, hadn't come to betray Tanner exactly either, had come for some reason that was probably less defined than either of those things. The complex interior accounting of a mother who loved her son and knew what he was, and had to live with both of those facts. Harper didn't like Marlene, had never particularly liked her, but she understood her a little better now, and that was its own kind of information. She went inside and called Walter Fenn. They're going to attack my credibility at the hearing, she said. Emotional woman, grief-clouded judgment. That's going to be their angle. I know, Walter said. I've dealt with Clifford Brace before. He's very good at that particular move. How do we counter it? By being boring, Walter said. Thorough, documented, and boring. You don't give an emotional performance. You give facts. Water quality data, environmental impact assessments, precedent cases, the specific restrictions in the trust documents, and what they mean under state law. You make the hearing about the land, not about your feelings about the land. The moment it becomes about your feelings, they have something to work with. My feelings are not the issue, Harper said. I know, but feelings are easier to dismiss than data, so we lead with data. She spent the next 4 days essentially preparing for the most important presentation of her life. She wasn't, by nature, a public speaker. She'd spent most of her adult life in roles that didn't require it, managing the family estate after her mother's death, then her father's, the kind of behind-the-scenes administrative work that required precision and patience rather than performance. She'd sat in on enough of Tanner's presentations to know how they worked, how he constructed an argument and deployed it, how he read a room and adjusted. She'd learned a great deal, sitting in those rooms saying nothing. She was going to use what she'd learned. Walter sent her a structured brief. She amended it, cut what was redundant, reorganized the sequence to build the environmental argument before the legal argument, because the legal argument would land harder if the audience already understood what was at stake ecologically. She practiced it out loud in her father's living room, standing at the fireplace because it was the right height, talking to the empty furniture. Dottie came over on the eve of the hearing and sat on the couch and listened to the full presentation. "Is it too much?" Harper asked when she finished. Dottie considered. "The water quality section is a little long." "I thought it might be. The part about your father's correspondence with the county. Keep all of that. Don't cut a word of that." "Okay." "And Harper," Dottie looked at her steadily, "you know this material. You don't need to perform knowing it. Just talk." "I know. I mean it. When you started talking about the trust structure, you sounded like a lawyer. When you talked about the birch trees he planted, you sounded like a person. The second one is more compelling." Harper sat down. The evening light was coming through the west-facing windows, long and low, filling the room with the same amber quality it had every evening of every summer she'd ever spent in this house. "I'm not trying to win a sympathy vote," she said. "No. You're trying to win a planning board vote, but planning boards are made of people." Dottie shrugged. "Just don't forget that." The Millhaven County Planning Board held its public hearings in a meeting room at the county building that seated approximately 80 people and had, on this particular Thursday evening, approximately 120. The overflow stood along the back wall and spilled into the hallway. Harper had not expected that. Walter had warned her the hearing would be attended. He hadn't warned her it would look like this. The folding chairs filled with a cross-section of the county that included lakefront property owners, environmental advocates, local business operators who had opinions in both directions, and what appeared to be a contingent of Griggs Development Group employees who had been encouraged to attend and had worn, with some variation, a particular shade of blue that probably wasn't accidental. Tanner was there. She'd known he would be. He was seated at the applicant's table with Clifford Brace and two other people she didn't recognize, a woman with an architectural portfolio and a man in a suit that probably cost more than Dottie's car. Tanner had his presentation face on, the one she'd watched him assemble 100 times, relaxed, confident, fractionally warmer than his default setting, calibrated for a room of county officials and community members rather than investors. He saw her come in. She was with Walter Fenn and Ray Pellegrino and 3 other property owners from the Eastern Shore, and she walked in with them, and Tanner watched her cross the room, and something moved across his face, just briefly, just a flicker, that she read as recalibration. He hadn't expected her to have people with her. She sat down, opened her folder, didn't look at him again. The board chair, a heavy-set man named Gerald Croft, who had the energy of someone who'd been managing contentious public hearings for 20 years and had developed a very specific variety of patience for it, called the session to order at 6:05. He explained the procedure. The applicant would present first. Public comment would follow. The board would deliberate, and a decision would be issued within 30 days. Clifford Brace stood up. I was a tall man, well-dressed in the specific way of someone who understood that clothes communicated before you opened your mouth. He had a good voice. Not showy, just clear and measured, the kind of voice that implied he'd thought carefully about everything he was about to say. He presented the Griggs Development Group proposal with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed it thoroughly and was comfortable with the material. The economic benefits, job creation, tax revenue, tourism spending, the design principles, sustainable waterfront architecture, environmental sensitivity, low-impact marina construction, the projected community benefits, public access points, a restored wetland buffer, community event space. It was, Harper had to admit, a good presentation. It was not honest. The public access points were technically public under a definition that would effectively require reservation and fee, and the restored wetland buffer was a narrow strip that did not begin to offset the ecological impact of the marina expansion. But it was coherent and professional and delivered with the kind of smooth assurance that boards often responded well to. Tanner spoke for 5 minutes at the end, talked about his vision for the Eastern Shore, his respect for the natural environment, his family's long connection to the Millhaven area. He didn't look at Harper. He was very good at not looking at Harper. Gerald Croft opened the floor for public comment. Walter Fenn went first as they'd planned. He was 61, had been practicing land use law in Millhaven County for 32 years, and knew every member of the planning board by name, and in some cases by the legal disputes he'd navigated over decades. He was not flashy. He was exactly what he'd advised Harper to be: thorough, documented, and boring in the specific way that communicated competence and seriousness. He walked the board through the 8 years of environmental documentation he'd assembled. He cited case law. He referenced the specific trust restrictions on the Doyle parcel in terms that made their legal weight unmistakable. He did all of this in 17 minutes without raising his voice once. Ray Pellegrino went next. He was shorter than Walter and less polished and considerably more direct. He told the board that he'd been on Callaway Lake for 51 years, that his father had built their lake house in 1973, and that 2 years ago he'd received an offer from a company called Lakeview Capital Partners, which was, as he'd subsequently learned, a subsidiary of Griggs Development Group, to purchase his property. And when he declined, he'd received a follow-up communication suggesting that if he didn't sell voluntarily, the regulatory environment around the Eastern Shore might shift in ways that made private ownership more complicated. He pulled the letters out of a folder and read from them directly. There was a murmur in the room. Clifford Brace objected that the letters were irrelevant to the variance application. Gerald Croft allowed the testimony and noted the objection for the record. 2 other Eastern Shore owners spoke. A woman who'd been coming to Callaway Lake since childhood and described in clear, specific terms what a 42-unit commercial resort would do to the water quality and the wildlife patterns on the Eastern Shore. She was a retired environmental scientist, and she spoke for 11 minutes with the same calibrated authority Walter had, citing specific studies, specific precedents, specific projections. A man in his 50s who ran a local marine equipment business and said, flatly, that the development would benefit exactly the kind of tourism that priced out the local economy within a decade, and that anyone who thought otherwise hadn't watched what happened to 3 other lake communities in the state over the past 20 years. Then it was Harper's turn. She stood up. The room was warm, too many people in a space built for fewer, and her notes were in her hand and her throat was dry in the way it always was before she had to speak in front of people. A fact she'd kept mostly private because it didn't fit the composed exterior she'd maintained for most of her adult life. She thought about what Dottie had said. Just talk. My name is Harper Doyle, she said. My father was Everett Doyle. He built the property at 14 Lakeshore East in 1987 and maintained it, and the land around it, for the next 30 years. She didn't look at Tanner. I want to start with something that isn't in my notes, she said, because I think it's relevant to everything that follows. My father came to this planning office twice that I can verify from his files. The first time was in 2009, about a boundary question on the eastern property line. The second time was in 2014, when he filed documentation related to the Doyle Family Preservation Trust. She paused. He also attended, by my count from the meeting minutes I found in his files, 14 Callaway Lake Property Owners Association meetings between 2010 and his death in 2019. He attended planning board public sessions 7 times. He kept records of every interaction. He did this quietly and without making it anyone else's problem because that was his way. She could feel the room. It had shifted slightly. The specific attentiveness of people who've been sitting through professional presentations and are now hearing something different. I'm standing here tonight because he prepared me to, she said. Not explicitly. He was not an explicit man, but he put the documents in the filing cabinet, and he worked with Walter Fenn for 8 years, and he set up a trust with restrictions specific enough that they've survived my husband's legal team's attempts to challenge them for 3 weeks. He did all of that because he knew something was coming. He knew what the Eastern Shore looked like to a certain kind of investor, and he knew the only thing standing between the lake and that investor was the people who lived on it and were willing to show up. She put her notes on the podium. So I'm going to talk about the data, because the data is important, and I want this board to have it. But I also want you to understand that the data was assembled by a man who spent 30 years paying attention to this specific piece of water, and what it tells us is not abstract. It's about what happens to a lake when you put a 42-unit resort and an expanded marina on its eastern shoreline. She went through it. The water quality data, phosphorus levels, clarity measurements, the documented impact of marina fuel runoff on similar lake ecosystems within the state, the wildlife patterns, the heron nesting areas on the eastern bank, the migratory routes that ran through the protected wetland adjacent to the Doyle parcel, the osprey population that had been recovering on Callaway's eastern shore for a decade, the precedent cases, 4 comparable developments in the state over the past 25 years, and what had happened to water quality, property values, and community character in each one within 10 years of construction. She was not boring, exactly, but she was not performing either. She was just telling the board what the data said, and what the data said was consistent and clear, and she could see from the faces in the front row that at least 3 of the 7 board members were writing things down. She talked for 22 minutes. Dottie had said the water quality section was too long, and she'd cut it by a third, and it was still the strongest part. At the end, she said, "The Doyle Family Preservation Trust restricts development on the parcel my family owns. But beyond the legal question of that specific parcel, I'm asking this board to consider what the eastern shore of Callaway Lake is going to look like in 20 years under the proposed development versus what it is now." My father thought that question had a clear answer. I think he was right. I think the data supports him. She sat down. Walter leaned over. "Good," he said quietly. Clifford Brace's rebuttal was smooth and professional and addressed the environmental concerns with a series of projected mitigation measures that sounded specific and turned out, on closer examination, to contain a great deal of qualified language about projected outcomes rather than guaranteed ones. He addressed the trust issue by reiterating that its legal status remained under challenge. He did not address Ray Pellegrino's letters. The board asked questions for 40 minutes. Most of the questions went to Walter and to the retired environmental scientist. 2 questions went to Clifford Brace, and his answers were longer than they needed to be, which Harper read as a sign of mild pressure. One board member, a woman named Lissa Tran, who had the focused energy of someone who had done her homework before arriving, asked Clifford Brace directly whether Griggs Development Group had made any prior contact with Eastern Shoreline property owners before filing the variance application. Outreach had been conducted. Lissa Tran looked at him. "I'm asking specifically about Lakeview Capital Partners and the correspondence that was read into testimony tonight." A pause. "Lakeview Capital Partners is a separate entity. That is a subsidiary of Griggs Development Group," Lissa Tran said. "Is that correct?" Another pause, slightly longer. "There is a corporate relationship, yes." "Thank you," Lissa Tran said, and wrote something down. Gerald Croft called the session to close at 8:47. The board would deliberate and issue its decision within 30 days. The room began to unsort itself, chairs scraping, conversations starting, the general noise of 120 people beginning to move at once. Harper stood and gathered her folder. Walter was talking to Ray Pellegrino, the retired environmental scientist, whose name was Dr. Vera Osei, and who had driven 2 hours to be there, was exchanging cards with Lissa Tran. She felt Tanner before she saw him. The particular quality of his attention when it was directed at her, something she'd spent 15 years learning to read and had never fully been able to ignore. He was standing 6 feet away, Clifford Brace just behind him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not angry, exactly. More like a man recalculating something he'd been certain about and finding the numbers weren't adding up the way he'd expected. "That was a good presentation," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you." "I didn't know you'd been through his files." "There was a lot I hadn't done," she said. "I had time." A pause. Around them the room was still moving, still noisy, but there was a quality to the space between them that was its own small pocket of quiet. "This doesn't have to be what it's become," he said. "There are ways to structure a settlement that—" "Tanner." She picked up her folder. "We can talk through our attorneys." "I know what you're trying to do." She said it without heat. "You're trying to see if the hearing shook me enough to negotiate. It didn't." He looked at her. Whatever he saw apparently confirmed something, because after a moment he nodded, very slightly, and said nothing else. She walked past him toward the door where Walter and Ray were waiting, and she didn't look back. And she didn't feel victorious because this wasn't over, and she was realistic enough to know it. She felt tired and clear-headed and quietly certain that she had done the thing she'd come to do. Outside the county building, the night air was still warm, the parking lot lit by those wide-spaced sodium lights that make everything look faintly amber. Dr. Osei fell into step beside her. "Your presentation was good," she said. "The phosphorus sequencing was particularly well structured." "I had good source material," Harper said. "My father kept 20 years of water quality logs." Dr. Osei looked at her sideways. "He sounds like he was an unusual man." "He was," Harper said. "I'm starting to understand how unusual." Walter drove her back to the lake house. He didn't say much on the way. He was a man who processed things internally, which she appreciated. When he dropped her off at the top of the gravel drive, he said, "Lissa Tran's question was the moment. If she followed up on the Lakeview connection before tonight, that's significant." "How significant?" "Enough that I think we have a real chance. Not a certainty, but a real chance." She thanked him and went inside. The house was dark and quiet and smelled of cedar, and she turned on the kitchen light and stood in it for a moment, just breathing. Her phone had 17 messages. She scrolled through them without opening most. Meredith, Dottie, a few numbers she didn't recognize that were probably reporters who'd found her somehow. She opened Dottie's. Heard from Margaret. She says Lissa Tran filed a formal inquiry with the county ethics office about the Lakeview subsidiary relationship. Tonight, after the hearing. A pause in the text thread. "Your father would have liked tonight." Harper put the phone down on the counter. She went to the back door, unlocked it, stepped out onto the porch. The lake was dark. A kind of layered darkness, not flat, with the tree line against the sky and the water just barely catching the starlight. The dock was a shadow extending into it. The frogs were going. Had been going all week, would go all summer, had been going every summer of her entire life. She sat on the porch step and let herself be tired. Just tired, nothing more dramatic than that. The kind of tired that comes after doing something hard and doing it as well as you could and not knowing yet whether it was enough. The night smelled like the lake, like it always did, like it had on every summer evening she could remember, running all the way back to when she was small enough that her father would carry her out here on his shoulders so she could see over the porch railing. She sat there until she got cold. Then she went inside and went to bed. The board's 30-day deliberation window turned out to be the strangest month of Harper's life, which was saying something given the month that had preceded it. She went back to Atlanta for 10 days in the middle of it. Not because she wanted to exactly, but because there were practical things that needed handling. The apartment she and Tanner had shared for 12 years, which was in his name on the lease, and which she had never particularly loved, but had lived in long enough that it contained a version of her life that needed to be sorted and boxed and reckoned with. Margaret had negotiated a reasonable window for her to retrieve her belongings, and Harper drove down on a Tuesday morning with a rental van and a list she'd written at the kitchen table in the lakehouse, and Meredith, who had flown in from Portland without being asked. "You didn't have to come," Harper said when she picked Meredith up from the airport. "I know," Meredith said, and didn't elaborate because she didn't need to. That was the particular efficiency of a sister who'd known you since before either of you had language. The apartment was strange. Not wrong, exactly. It was still the same rooms, the same light through the same windows, but it had the quality of a place that had already moved on without her, the way a shared space sometimes does when the balance of who inhabits it has shifted. Tanner's things were still there. His books, his running shoes by the door, the particular arrangement of objects on the kitchen counter that reflected his habits and not hers. She moved through the rooms with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided not to feel things about a task until the task is finished. Meredith, to her credit, understood this and matched her pace. They were 3 hours in, Harper in the bedroom, going through the closet, Meredith wrapping things in the second bedroom that Harper had used as a home office, when Meredith appeared in the doorway, holding a small framed photograph. "Did you know this was in here?" she said. Harper looked. It was a picture she hadn't thought about in years. The two of them as children at the lakehouse, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing on the dock with fishing rods. Their father was behind them, slightly out of focus, laughing at something. Their mother had taken the photograph, and you could tell because she'd cut off half the dock, the same compositional tic Harper had apparently inherited. "I forgot I had that," Harper said. "It was in a drawer, under some paper clips." Meredith looked at it a moment longer. "You should have this in the lakehouse." "I'll take it." Meredith set it in the keep pile without further discussion. Harper went back to the closet. Her hands were working steadily, folding, stacking, making decisions. And she was doing fine. She was genuinely fine, until she found at the back of the closet shelf, behind her winter sweaters, an old flannel shirt of her father's that she'd brought back from the lakehouse years ago and apparently never moved. She stood with it in her hands for a moment. "Mare?" she called. "Yeah. I'm fine." "I know," Meredith called back. She put the flannel shirt in the box with the photograph. Then she sat on the edge of the bed for exactly 4 minutes, looking at the window, before she got up and went back to work. They finished in 6 hours. The rental van held more than she'd expected. She'd accumulated more of a life than she'd realized, apparently, in 12 years of shared space. They drove the van to a storage unit she'd rented near Meredith's hotel and unloaded it and ate bad Thai food at a place nearby and talked until midnight about things that had nothing to do with Tanner or the lakehouse or the hearing, and then Harper drove back to the apartment one more time because she'd realized she'd left her mother's mixing bowls in the kitchen cabinet and she wasn't leaving those. The apartment was empty when she got there. Just Tanner's things, rearranged slightly. He'd moved things around while she'd been packing, which struck her as characteristic, the subtle reassertion of ownership over a space. She went to the kitchen and found the bowls and stood in the kitchen with them under her arm. He was standing in the living room doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He was still in work clothes, his jacket over his arm, and he looked tired, genuinely tired, not performance tired. The particular drawn quality around his eyes that she knew meant he'd been running on adrenaline and was reaching the end of it. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "I didn't think you'd still be here," he said. "I forgot these." She indicated the bowls. He nodded, came into the kitchen and put his jacket over the back of a chair and stood with his hands in his pockets, which was the posture she'd seen 100 times and which she was no longer obligated to decode. "How long were you planning this?" she asked. The question came out level. She'd wondered it for weeks and hadn't asked it, and they were alone in the apartment for probably the last time, and she wanted the actual answer. He looked at her. "What specifically?" "The development. Callaway Lake. When did you start planning it?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "The initial concept was about 3 years ago." 3 years ago. They'd been married for 12 years at that point. She'd been going to the lake house 4 times a year, alone, while he had what she now understood were legitimate business reasons for encouraging her to go without him, for encouraging the separation that would eventually make the divorce cleaner. "Did you ever intend for us to work?" she asked. Another silence, different from the first one. "I thought we could," he said finally. "At the beginning, I think I thought we could." He looked at the counter. "I'm not built the way you needed me to be built. I don't know when I understood that. Probably later than I should have." It was the most honest thing he'd said to her in years, maybe in the history of their marriage. She wasn't sure whether that made it better or worse. "Was any of it real?" she asked. He looked at her, and then he said quietly, "The beginning was real." She stood in the kitchen with her mother's mixing bowls for a moment. The apartment hummed around them, the refrigerator, the HVAC, the distant sound of traffic 16 floors below. "Okay," she said. She picked up her keys. "Harper," he started. "We can talk through our attorneys," she said. Same as before. She left. Drove back to the storage unit, added the bowls to a box, drove to Meredith's hotel, and knocked on her door at 11:30 at night. Meredith opened it, looking unsurprised. "He was there," Harper said. "Come in." She sat on the edge of Meredith's hotel bed and told her what had happened, word for word, because Meredith was the only person in her life she could do that with, the only person who had known both of them long enough to understand the full context without needing it explained. Meredith listened without interrupting, which she was, unlike Dottie, actually good at. "The beginning was real," Meredith repeated. "That's what he said." "Yes." "Do you believe him?" Harper thought about it. The question deserved the consideration. "I think he believes it," she said finally. "I think there are people who are genuinely different at 28 than they are at 45, and he might be one of them. I don't know whether that makes it better." "It doesn't make it okay." "No, it doesn't make it okay." She looked at the carpet. "But it makes it human, and I'm trying to keep holding the human version of things." Meredith looked at her. "You're doing better than I would be." "I'm not doing better. I'm just doing it differently." She picked up the spare pillow from the other side of the bed. "Can I stay here tonight?" "Obviously," Meredith said. "What?" She drove back to the lake house 3 days later. Meredith went back to Portland. Her kids needed her. Her life was there. And Harper had said goodbye at the airport with the particular fullness that comes from a week of real proximity after years of maintained distance and driven north. The lake in late June was different from the lake in early June. The trees were fully out now, the water warmer, the shoreline thicker with vegetation. The herons were nesting in the tall marsh grass at the edge of the Doyle property's wetland area. Harper had been watching them for 2 weeks, marking the location, photographing it with the good camera she'd found in her father's closet, adding the documentation to Walter's file. She'd settled into a routine at the lakehouse that she recognized as both practical and necessary. She got up early, earlier than she ever had in Atlanta, where the schedule of their social life had pushed everything later, and she'd stopped being naturally a morning person somewhere around year 8 of the marriage. Here she was up at 6, sometimes earlier, and she'd sit on the dock with coffee while the light came up and the herons started their morning work in the shallows. She ran the back property trail twice a week. She was not a runner, had never been a runner, but the trail through the birch trees was flat enough and short enough that it didn't require her to be one. She cooked actual meals, which she hadn't done consistently in years. She talked to Walter every 2 or 3 days. She talked to Margaret when there was something to report, which was increasingly often, because Tanner's legal team had not been idle during the 30-day window. 2 weeks after the hearing, Clifford Brace filed an amended challenge to the Doyle Family Preservation Trust, this time on the basis of a specific provision in the original trust documentation that, they argued, contained ambiguous language regarding the definition of residential use, and whether certain improvements made to the property during the marriage might constitute a waiver of the trust's protection under a doctrine called equitable estoppel. Margaret explained equitable estoppel to Harper in terms she could work with. Essentially, Clifford Brace was arguing that because Tanner had participated in maintaining and improving the lakehouse property during the marriage, the trust's protections had been effectively waived by course of conduct. Can they win on that? Harper asked. It's a stretch, Margaret said. The improvements were minor. There's a record of what was done and when, and none of it rises to the level that courts have typically required for an estoppel claim. But it's not frivolous. It's the kind of argument that creates expensive uncertainty. What did he actually do to the property? According to the filing, they're citing the dock repair in 2018 and the roof work in 2020. Harper thought about this. She'd arranged both projects. She'd hired the contractors, supervised the work, paid the invoices from the trust account she managed. Tanner had not been present for either job. He'd barely known they happened. He wasn't there for either of those projects, she said. I handled both of them completely independently. Do you have documentation, contracts, invoices, correspondence with the contractors? My father kept records of everything. The filing system in his office has every invoice going back to 1991. Then pull everything related to both projects. I want receipts, contracts, email if it exists, any written record of who made the decisions and who paid for the work. Harper went to the filing cabinet that afternoon. She found the dock repair folder, 2018, labeled in her father's handwriting, which she recognized as the folder he'd started and she'd continued after his death. She found every invoice, the contractor's name, the dates of work, the payment records from the trust account, her email correspondence authorizing the work and approving the final invoice. Not Tanner's name anywhere. She photographed everything and sent it to Margaret within the hour. Perfect, Margaret said when she called back. This effectively guts the estoppel argument. The improvements were made entirely under your authority as trust administrator. He had no role. He was in Atlanta, Harper said. He was in Atlanta both times. I told him about the dock and he said, whatever you think is best. Do you have that in writing? He texted it. I still have the text. A short silence from Margaret's end, then, Harper, send me that text. Sending now. She was getting better at this, not comfortable with it. There was nothing comfortable about dismantling a marriage document by document, building a legal record out of the accumulated evidence of a relationship, but competent. She understood now what her father had understood, which was that the work of protecting something happened long before the moment you needed the protection. He'd spent decades building a record. She was spending weeks extending it. The cabinet in his office was not just a filing system. It was an argument, organized by year and category, waiting for exactly the use it was now being put to. On the 22nd day of the 30-day window, Walter Finn called. I've heard from a board member, he said. Off the record, informally, but I've heard. Harper was on the dock. She stood up. What did you hear? The Lissa Tran inquiry has generated a formal finding from the county ethics office. It's not criminal. That's not what the ethics office does. But it's a finding that Griggs Development Group, through its Lakeview Capital Partners subsidiary, engaged in a pattern of communication with Eastern Shoreline property owners that misrepresented the subsidiary's relationship to the development group. which is a polite way of saying they lied to the neighbors about who they were. Essentially, the finding doesn't invalidate the variance application itself, but it is now part of the public record attached to the application, and it is available to the board in its deliberations. A pause. It is also, at this point, available to local media. Harper hadn't thought about that. Has anyone called you? A reporter from the Millhaven Register called this morning. I told him I couldn't discuss ongoing proceedings. He's going to call you. He called at 3:15. His name was Derek Chu. No relation to Margaret, just a coincidence that briefly disoriented her. And he was professional and direct. He was writing a story about the variance application, the ethics finding, and the public hearing, and he wanted Harper's perspective on her family's history with the property and her involvement in opposing the application. She thought for a moment. Then she said, I'm willing to talk about my father's conservation work and about what the Eastern Shore means to the community. I'm not going to discuss the divorce proceedings. Understood, Derek said. Can we do this tomorrow? Come to the lakehouse, she said. Bring a photographer if you want. He came with a photographer. They walked the property, the lakehouse, the dock, the birch trees, the wetland edge where the herons were nesting. And Harper talked about her father in the same way she'd talked about him at the hearing. Not performance, not sentimentality, just the factual account of a man who had paid attention and worked quietly and left something real behind. Derek was a good interviewer. He asked questions that required actual answers rather than talking points, and he listened when she answered. The story ran 4 days later, on a Wednesday, and it was longer than she'd expected and more prominent, above the fold on the front page of the Register, with a photograph of Harper standing on the dock in the early morning light, the lake spread out behind her. The headline was simple: Callaway Lake, What One Family Built and Why It Matters. She read it at the kitchen table with coffee and felt strange about it. Not bad, exactly. The story was accurate and fair, but strange in the way that becomes visible when your private struggle becomes a thing other people can read about over breakfast. The specifics of her marriage weren't in it, as she'd requested, but the context was legible to anyone who paid attention. A woman defending her family's land from a development plan filed by her husband's company during their marriage. The subtext was available even if the text didn't say it. Tanner would read it, his attorneys would read it. That was a given. What she hadn't anticipated was the calls. Her phone started that Wednesday morning and didn't really stop for 3 days. Not reporters, she redirected those to Walter, but people, Eastern Shore residents she didn't know well. People who'd grown up on Callaway Lake and moved away and still read the Register online. Former colleagues of her father's. A woman who'd been her mother's friend in the 1990s and called just to say she'd read the article and that Everett would have been proud, which Harper had to receive standing in the backyard facing away from the house, so that her reaction wasn't visible to anyone who might be watching. And then, on Friday of that week, Ray Pellegrino called. I got a call from someone at the county, he said. He was a man who didn't editorialize, who led with the fact. The board is going to issue its decision Monday. Monday. That was 3 days earlier than the 30-day deadline. Is that good? This person thought so. They didn't say which way, but they said the board has a strong consensus and they didn't need the full window. He paused. Strong consensus either way means the same thing at this point. It meant they hadn't been persuaded to table the decision for more study or a follow-up process, which was what happened when a board was genuinely split. It meant they'd looked at everything: the application, the testimony, the ethics finding, the environmental documentation, the 8 years of Walter's work, and had arrived somewhere together, which could be good or could be not good, but at least it was a decision. Okay, Harper said. Monday. She called Walter. He'd heard the same thing from a different source. I was cautious. He'd been doing this long enough not to read confidence into process indicators. But he didn't sound pessimistic. She called Margaret and updated her. Margaret reported that Clifford Brace had filed for an expedited hearing on the estoppel argument, which Margaret assessed as a sign that his team was anticipating the variance denial and wanted legal cover in place before it arrived. That night, Dottie came over without soup, just herself, which was a different kind of gift. And they sat on the front porch until 9 o'clock and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. Dottie's late husband, who died 11 years ago, and whom she talked about with the pragmatic affection of someone who'd integrated loss into daily life without making it the center of everything. her son in Columbus, who called on Sundays and usually talked too long about his job. The garden she was putting in along her east fence, which was behind schedule because her hip had kept her from kneeling for 2 months. "Have you thought about what happens after?" Dottie said at one point. "After Monday?" "After all of it. After the divorce is settled and the variance is decided and the legal things are done. What you do with the lake house." Harper looked at the dark. "I've thought about it. And? I want to stay. Not just for summers. I want to figure out how to actually live here." She paused. "I've been thinking about what my father did with the neighbors, the loose group of people who'd been talking about the conservation designation. I want to see if that can go somewhere, formal or informal, just continued. Walter's been working on that for years." "I know. But there's a difference between a land use attorney building a file and actually having the community organized around a common purpose. I think the hearing changed something. I think people who showed up that night are different from how they were before it." Dottie was quiet for a moment. "Your father used to say the same kind of thing," she said, "about how community is just the word for what happens when people decide to pay attention to the same things at the same time." Harper turned and looked at her. "He said that?" "On this porch, actually, about 12 years ago. We were talking about the lake, and he said it, and I thought about it for weeks afterward." Dottie smiled, which she didn't do with great frequency, but which, when she did, was very genuine. "He talked to me a lot, your father, when he got lonely after your mother died. I don't know if you knew that." "I didn't. We used to sit out here and he'd talk about you and Meredith and about the lake and about what he hoped for it." She looked out at the dark. "He worried you'd get too far away from this place." Harper felt the familiar constriction in her chest. "I did. And then you came back. And then I came back." They sat with that for a while. The frogs were going. The lake was making the sounds it always made at night. Barely audible, just present, a low continuous register of living water. Monday morning arrived gray and close, the kind of overcast that could become rain or could burn off by 10 and never quite commit to either. Harper was on the dock at 6:30 anyway, coffee in hand, watching the water. At 9:15, Walter called. "The board voted 6-1 to deny the variance application," he said. "The denial is on environmental grounds, citing insufficient mitigation measures for the impact on water quality and wildlife habitat, and on procedural grounds, citing the ethics office finding regarding the Lakeview Capital Partners communications." Harper sat down in the aluminum chair. 6-1, she said. "Clifford Brace will appeal. That's standard, and he'll do it. But an appeal of a variance denial on these grounds, with this evidentiary record, is an uphill case. It can be done, but it's expensive and slow, and the odds are significantly against him." "How long does an appeal take?" "If he files, 18 months to 2 years before it's resolved. Maybe longer." A pause. "But Harper, I've talked to 2 of the investors in the Griggs Development Eastern Shore project. Off the record. Investors don't like 18-month uncertain appeals. Investors like certainty." She understood what he was saying. "The financing might not hold." "The financing might not hold," Walter confirmed. "I don't know that, but it's a real possibility." She thanked him and sat on the dock for a long time after the call. Not celebrating exactly. It wasn't that kind of feeling. It was more like the moment when a thing you've been bracing against finally resolves, and your body has to figure out what to do with the tension it was storing. Margaret called it 10. The ethics finding and the variance denial together were going to significantly alter the landscape of the divorce settlement negotiation, she said. The estoppel argument was now harder to advance credibly. Clifford Brace had based part of his procedural leverage on the assumption that the variance would at minimum proceed to appeal and create sustained uncertainty around the property's status. That leverage was diminished. "He's going to want to settle," Margaret said, "probably sooner than he was planning. What should we ask for?" "What do you need?" Harper thought about it. Not about what she wanted, which was a different question and not one that litigation could answer. What she needed, practically, going forward. "Financial independence," she said. "I haven't had a salary in 3 years. I need a settlement that gives me time to build something without the lakehouse maintenance costs swallowing me whole." "I can get you that. And I need the Doyle parcel formally, permanently, finally off the table. Nothing he or his attorneys can come back to." We can document that so thoroughly it would take a team of attorneys a decade to find a foothold. That's what I do." "Okay," Harper said. "Then let's be ready when he calls." He called through his attorneys that same afternoon. She didn't speak to Tanner directly. He'd wanted to. There was a note in the communication asking whether she'd take a call. And she'd declined through Margaret, not out of hostility, but because she'd said what she had to say to him in that empty apartment, and the rest of it was the attorney's work. The negotiation took 9 more days. Harper stayed at the lakehouse through all of it, going through her father's files in the mornings, walking the property in the afternoons, talking to Margaret in the evenings. Ray Pellegrino came by on the 3rd day to say the planning board decision had been picked up by a regional environmental news outlet, and that he'd heard from 3 Eastern Shore owners who'd never been to a property owners meeting in their lives and wanted to know when the next one was. "Tell them 2 weeks, Harper said. "We'll have it here." He looked at her. "Here? At the lake house?" "My father used to have them here, in the backyard." She looked at the yard. "It's time to start that back up." Dottie, when told, immediately volunteered to bring food. Dr. Vera Osei, when Harper called to update her on the variance denial, said she'd attend the meeting and had 2 colleagues who did freshwater ecology work and had been looking for a local community with organized conservation intent. Something was gathering. Harper could feel it. Not the anxious, reactive quality of the past several weeks, but something with more structural integrity to it, something that had roots. Her father had started it, left it incomplete, left it waiting. She was not the same person he'd hoped she'd become. She was more complicated than that, more knocked around, carrying more evidence of where she'd gone wrong and stayed too long in the wrong places. But she was here, and she understood now what needed doing. On the 9th day, Margaret called with the final settlement terms. Harper sat at her father's desk and went through them. The financial settlement was fair. Not generous, not punitive, just fair, which was what she'd asked for and what she'd gotten. Her name removed from any shared obligation. The Doyle parcel formally, comprehensively, permanently documented as outside any claim he or his successors might make. The marriage, 15 years of it, resolved into a stack of legal language that took 42 pages to say that 2 people had stopped belonging to each other. She read all 42 pages. Then she signed. Margaret filed the signed documents within the hour. Harper sat at the desk for a long time after. Her father's filing cabinet was to her left. His old calendar was still on the wall. 2019, the year he died, stuck on April, which was the month he'd gone into the hospital for the last time. She'd never taken it down. She looked at it and thought that she probably should, and that she also probably wasn't ready to, and that both things could be true. She got up and went to the kitchen, made coffee, stood at the window over the sink and looked at the lake in the late afternoon light, at the way it was doing what it always did at this hour, gold going to copper, going to the rich, ambiguous colors of early evening. The herons were in the shallows. Both of them, which she'd come to understand was unusual enough to notice. They typically worked the shoreline at different times, avoiding each other. Today they were both there, working the same stretch of water 30 feet apart, efficient and separate, and somehow entirely companionable. She watched them for a long time. Her phone buzzed. Meredith. Margaret called me. "It's done?" Harper texted back, "It's done." 3 dots appeared, then, "How are you?" She thought about it, tried to find the accurate answer. Not the reassuring one, not the dramatic one, the true one. "Tired," she typed. And okay. Both at once. Meredith's response came back. "That's the right answer." Harper put the phone down. The lake was still doing what it did. The herons were still there. The dock extended out over the water the way it always had, the same boards over the same pilings in the same lake, and in 2 weeks she was going to fill her father's backyard with the neighbors he'd been trying to gather for 30 years. She picked up the pink granite paperweight from where she'd put it on the desk 3 weeks ago and turned it in her hand, warm from the afternoon light, smooth on one side where decades of hands had worn it so. She carried it to the window and held it there, in the light, looking at the lake. The community meeting happened on a Saturday in early July, 2 weeks after the settlement was signed, on a day that started overcast and then opened up around 9 in the morning into the kind of clear, unhurried summer light that makes everything look like it has more time than it does. Harper had set up chairs in the backyard the night before, a mix of her father's old folding chairs from the storage shed and a dozen borrowed from Dottie and Ray and the Pellegrinos, arranged in a rough semicircle facing the slope down to the lake. She'd set up a folding table with coffee and the kind of food she'd watched her mother put out for 30 years when people were coming. Nothing elaborate, nothing that required you to balance it awkwardly, just things you could eat standing up while you talked. Dottie had brought 2 pies, which were on the table before 8:30, because Dottie operated on a schedule that predated anyone else's. By 9:45, there were 23 people in her father's backyard. She hadn't expected that. Walter had said 12, maybe 15 if the Register article had moved people, and the variance denial had given them a sense of momentum. 23 was more than any Eastern Shoreline property owners meeting had drawn in her father's records going back to 2010. She counted twice, which was something her father would have done, and then she stopped counting and just let it be what it was. Ray opened the meeting because it felt right. He was the oldest continuous resident on the Eastern Shore, and he carried that with a quiet authority that didn't require anyone to announce it. He talked for 5 minutes about the variance denial and what it meant in practical terms, and then he talked for 2 more minutes about what it didn't mean, which was that the pressure was gone. This was one application, he said. There will be others, different names, different angles. The Eastern Shore is going to be attractive to development money for the rest of our lives, and probably our children's lives. What changes is whether there's a community organized well enough to respond. Then Dr. Vera Ose spoke. She'd driven 2 hours again, which Harper had told her wasn't necessary, and Dr. Ose had said she thought it was. She was a contained, direct woman who spoke about freshwater ecology the way people speak about things they've committed their professional lives to, not with the performance of passion, but with the steady, detailed intimacy of genuine knowledge. She explained what the Callaway Lake ecosystem actually was, in specific terms: the water table relationships, the wetland filtration functions, the migratory dependencies, the particular fragility of the Eastern Shoreline's nesting habitat. She had brought printed materials, which she distributed without fanfare, and she answered questions for 20 minutes with the patience of someone who has been answering the same questions for 30 years and understands that the questions are necessary. Harper spoke last. She'd prepared less than she had for the planning board hearing, which turned out to be the right call. She talked about her father, not as sentiment, but as context, the way you talk about a foundation when you're explaining what a building is meant to do. She talked about what she'd found in his filing cabinet, the decades of records and correspondence, the sustained quiet work of a man who understood that attention was the most basic form of protection. And then she said the thing she'd been working out for weeks. Not in any planned way, but in the organic, slow way that understanding arrives when you've been living inside a question long enough. My father never made speeches, she said. He didn't have a platform or an organization or a title. He just kept records and showed up and paid attention and maintained the things that needed maintaining. And when he died, he left behind enough documentation, enough legal infrastructure, enough relationships that the work could continue without him. She looked around the yard, at Ray and Dottie and Dr. Osai and the 20 other people who had come from up and down the Eastern Shore on a Saturday morning. I don't think the lesson is that one person with the right trust documents can hold off development forever. That's not really what happened here. What happened is that a lot of people paid attention over a long period of time, and the documentation was there when it was needed, and enough people showed up when it mattered. She paused. I want to build on that. Not because I'm trying to win anything, but because this lake is worth the work. And I think the people in this yard already know that. Nobody applauded. They weren't that kind of crowd. But there was a quality of collective attention that told her she'd said the right thing, and that was enough. The meeting ran 2.5 hours. By the end, they had the outlines of a formal structure. Not a legal entity yet, just an agreed framework, regular meetings, a shared documentation system, a relationship with Dr. Ose's Department for ongoing water quality monitoring, and a commitment to appear at any future planning proceedings that affected the Eastern Shoreline. Walter Fenn agreed to serve as legal advisor on a reduced fee basis. Dottie agreed to be the person who made sure everyone knew when meetings were happening, which was a role she was structurally suited for and accepted without any pretense of reluctance. When people finally started to leave, they left slowly, the way people do when they've been in a space that felt useful and aren't quite ready to break the feeling. Harper stood on the back porch and watched them go, talking to each other, carrying folding chairs back to their cars, stopping on the slope to look at the lake the way people look at something they've just been reminded they care about. Ray was the last to leave. He folded his chair and handed it to her and stood for a moment looking at the backyard, the lake beyond it. "Your father would have liked this," he said. Second time he'd said it. She didn't mind. "I think he'd have had notes," Harper said. Ray made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she'd heard from him. He always had notes. He walked back up the gravel road toward his property, and Harper stood on the porch until he was out of sight, and then she went inside. 3 weeks after that, Clifford Brace filed the variance appeal on behalf of Griggs Development Group. It was expected. Walter had prepared for it, had the response brief largely drafted before the appeal landed. What was less expected was what happened 2 weeks after the filing. Walter called on a Tuesday afternoon, and Harper could tell from the cadence of his voice before he said anything that the call was different from the routine updates. "Two of the primary investors in the Eastern Shore project have withdrawn," he said. She sat down on the porch step. "Both of them?" "Formally notified Griggs Development Group this morning. Their combined stake represented about 60% of the project's committed capital." A pause. "The appeal is still filed. The project isn't technically dead, but without that capital, it's very difficult to see how it moves forward in any meaningful timeline." "What made them withdraw?" "The appeal itself, partly. 18 months of uncertain litigation isn't what they signed on for. The ethics finding is now part of the public record, and it came up in their own due diligence reviews after the variance denial. And—" Walter paused, and she could hear him choosing whether to say the next thing. "The Register story was picked up by 2 regional outlets and 1 national environmental publication. It's generated a reputational dimension to this project that investors in this particular sector are sensitive to." Harper was quiet for a moment. "The story did that?" "The story named the project and the applicant and the ethics finding and the denial. When people search the project now, that's what they find." He paused. "You were careful in that interview. You talked about your father and the lake and the community. You didn't attack anyone personally. That turned out to matter." She hadn't done it strategically. She'd done it because attacking Tanner personally in a newspaper story felt like the wrong thing, felt like the kind of move that would make her into something she didn't want to be. But the effect was that the story was about the land and the community and the documented history of what had been built and protected on the Eastern Shore, and it was difficult to be the person trying to turn that into a 42-unit resort without looking like exactly what Griggs Development Group was. "What happens to the appeal without the capital?" she asked. "It can still proceed on paper, but a development appeal without a viable project behind it tends to become a formality. He may withdraw it in the next few months if he can't restructure the financing." A pause. "Margaret thinks the settlement will hold regardless. The trust documentation is now reinforced by the variance denial and the ethics finding and the investor withdrawal. Any future challenge would be starting from a significantly weaker position." "So it's over," Harper said. Not a question, exactly. More like testing how the word sounded. "It's not over. These things are never quite over, but it's functionally resolved." "Yes." She thanked him and sat on the step after the call ended. The lake was doing what it did. A motorboat crossed the middle distance, its wake arriving at the dock a minute later, the whole structure rocking gently on its pilings and then settling. She didn't feel what she expected to feel. She'd thought, during the weeks when everything was unresolved and the legal work was constant and she was falling asleep with case documents on her father's desk, that resolution would feel like relief, like something unlocking. What it actually felt like was quieter than that and more complicated. The particular flatness that comes when something you've been fighting very hard ends not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon and the sound of a motorboat on a lake. She thought about that for a while. About the gap between what we imagine resolution will feel like and what it actually is. She thought about the 15 years. Not about Tanner specifically, not in a way that still had heat to it, but about the larger thing. About what she'd been doing with herself during those 15 years, what she'd agreed to become, the slow degrees of accommodation that had added up to someone she didn't entirely recognize in the mirror by the end of it. She wasn't comfortable assigning all of that to him. She'd made choices. She'd stayed when leaving was already an option. She'd told herself the stories that made staying reasonable, and the stories had not been entirely false, but they had not been entirely honest either. People did that. She understood that better now than she had when she was inside it. People stay in things too long because leaving requires admitting that the staying was wrong, And admitting that the stain was wrong requires looking at yourself with an honesty that is genuinely uncomfortable. She hadn't wanted to do that. She'd wanted the marriage to be salvageable, not because she was naive, but because the alternative, that she'd made a serious mistake and spent 15 years inside it, was the kind of thing that sat heavily on a person's understanding of themselves. It sat heavily on her now, too. She wasn't past it. She didn't think you got past something like that so much as you learned to carry it with appropriate weight. Not so much that it crushed you, not so little that you avoided the real accounting. The real accounting was this. She had participated in her own diminishment. She had been complicit in the quiet suffocation of her own instincts. And also, she had come back. She had found the key and walked through the door and locked it behind her. And that had been her, not some crisis-forged version of herself, but a version that had always been available and that she had simply, finally, reached for. Both of those things were true at the same time. She was learning to hold both. Tanner came to the lakehouse in September. She hadn't expected it. He called first, texted, actually, which was more characteristic, asking whether she'd be willing to see him briefly, not about anything legal, just to talk. She thought about it for 2 days. Talked to Meredith, who had no strong opinion either way and said so. Talked to nobody else about it, because some decisions belong only to the person making them. She texted back, "You can come Saturday morning, an hour." He arrived on time, which was always one of his qualities. He was never late, considered lateness a form of disrespect, had organized his entire life around being exactly where he said he'd be at the time he said he'd be there. In that sense, walking up her gravel drive at 9:58 on a Saturday in September was entirely consistent with who he was. He looked like himself. Not diminished, not dramatically changed, just recognizably himself, with the slight adjustment of a man who has had a difficult few months and has not entirely finished processing them. He was wearing ordinary clothes, no performance of anything, and he carried a small paper bag that turned out to contain 2 cups of coffee from a place in town, which struck her as such a specifically Tanner gesture, practical, considered, a small neutralizing act, that she almost smiled. They sat on the front porch, same chairs they'd sat in when Marlene came, same view of the hydrangeas and the slope and the lake. He gave her a coffee. She accepted it. "The appeal is being withdrawn," he said. "Officially next week. I wanted you to hear it from me. Walter told me the financing fell through." "It did. That was..." He paused. "That was a consequence of a lot of choices I made. The Lakeview structure, the communications with the property owners, the timing of the application." He held his cup in both hands. "I cut corners I shouldn't have cut, and I told myself it was standard practice, and it wasn't." Harper looked at the hydrangeas. They were past their bloom now, the flowers faded and drying on the stems, which was its own particular kind of beauty if you were in the right frame of mind for it. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I was dishonest with you for a long time. Not just about Presley, about this place, about what I wanted from it, about how I thought about the marriage." He looked at the lake. "I'm not asking for anything. I know we're done. The attorneys made sure of that." A brief pause. "I just wanted to say it to your face." She considered him. This man she'd spent 15 years beside, who was at his best a person of genuine competence and occasional warmth, and at his worst a person who treated other people's attachment to things as an inconvenience to be managed. Both of those things had always been true of him. She'd wanted for a long time for only one of them to be true. "Was Presley part of the financial plan?" she asked. "Or was that separate?" He was quiet for a moment. "Both," he said. "She was at the firm we were using for the development design. It started as..." He stopped. "It doesn't matter how it started. The point is I made choices that weren't honest." "And now?" He looked at her. "She's not..." "That ended 2 months ago. I don't know if that's relevant to anything." "It isn't," Harper said, gently, not sharply. "It's really not." He nodded. He understood that. She could see that he understood it. They sat for a while in a silence that was not comfortable exactly, but was not hostile either. The complicated silence of 2 people who know each other well and have reached the end of what they were to each other. "Your father really did everything right," Tanner said finally. "The trust, the documentation, the relationships with Fenn and the county. He was 30 years ahead of everyone." "He was paying attention," Harper said, "to more than the property." He looked at her. "He knew what I was, Harper. I think he knew before you did. I know, she said. I found the trust documents dated 2 months after our first anniversary. Tanner was quiet. He looked at the lake for a long time. I should go, he said. She walked him to his car, not because it required ceremony, but because it was the kind of thing you did. You walked someone to their car. You allowed the ending to have its physical passage, its small ritual of departure. He put his hand on the door handle and then turned. Take care of the dock, he said. The far end, the third and fourth boards from the right. They're softer than they look. It was such an unexpected thing to say that she stood for a moment trying to locate its meaning. Then she understood. He'd walked the dock that first day, before she arrived, had actually noticed the boards, had filed the information somewhere, and was giving it to her now as the only useful thing he had left to offer. Okay, she said. Thank you. He got in the car and drove down the gravel road, and she stood in the upper yard until his car was gone. And then she stood there a little longer, looking at the tree line, the sky, the lake visible between the birch trees below. She went to the dock that afternoon with a pry bar and a measuring tape and a flashlight, which was how her father would have done it. Found the boards Tanner had noticed. He wasn't wrong. The third from the right showed soft spots on both sides of a seam that should have been tighter. Added it to the maintenance list she'd been keeping since June. Called the contractor who'd done the 2018 work and left a message. That was the thing, she thought, kneeling on the dock boards with the lake below her through the gaps, the water moving slowly on a September afternoon. The thing she was going to carry from all of this. The piece that felt true and earned rather than reassuring. Not that love redeems everything, or that justice arrives cleanly, or that the people who hurt you eventually become the agents of your liberation. Those were the versions of this story that she'd have been handed in a different kind of life, and she didn't entirely believe them. What she believed, kneeling on the dock her father built with his hands in 1987, was something quieter and more durable than that. She believed that attention was the most fundamental form of care, that the people who love you best are the ones who pay attention, who notice the soft boards, who write things down, who show up at meetings and maintain filing systems and plant birch trees along a clearing with the understanding that the trees will take decades to grow. And that's fine. That's exactly the point. Her father had understood that, had built his life around it so completely that the evidence of it was everywhere she looked, in the filing cabinet, in the trust documents, in Walter Fenn's 8 years of work, in the relationships he'd maintained quietly and without fanfare with the neighbors who now gathered in his backyard. She believed that the hardest thing was not the fighting. The fighting, when it finally came, had turned out to be something she was capable of. The hard thing had been the years before the fighting, the years of slowly accepting a version of herself that was smaller than the true version, the years of managing her own needs downward to fit the shape of a marriage that was not feeding her. That was the part she'd have to keep examining, not to punish herself, but to understand how it happened, so that the next time, and there would be a next time in some form, because life did not stop presenting the opportunity to diminish yourself if you were the kind of person who found diminishment familiar, she would recognize it earlier. She wasn't sure she'd get that right. She was aware that self-knowledge and actual behavior were different things, that understanding your patterns was not the same as escaping them. But she was going to try. She got up from the dock and went back to the house. The first real frost came in mid-October. She'd been at the lakehouse full-time for 4 months by then, had transferred what she needed from the Atlanta storage unit, had given away what she didn't, had settled into the specific rhythms of a life that was hers alone to organize. She'd begun consulting work, using the estate management and legal administrative skills she'd developed over years of handling her parents' affairs, picking up clients through Margaret's professional network, working from her father's desk in the mornings. It was not glamorous, and it was not what she'd imagined for herself at any prior point in her life. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was enough, for now, to be those things. The community organization, they'd named it the Callaway Lake Conservation Collective, which was functional, if not poetic, had held 3 meetings by October. The membership had grown to 31 households. Dr. Osai's department had begun the first formal water quality monitoring program the Eastern Shore had ever had. Walter had filed the paperwork for the conservation adjacent zone designation that her father and he had been working toward for 8 years, and the county planning office had acknowledged receipt with a response that Walter described as more encouraging than anything he'd received on the question in the previous 5 years. Meredith came for a long weekend in October. Stayed in the second bedroom, in the bed that had been their parents' bed, which Harper had moved downstairs after her father died. They cooked together in the kitchen that still had the uneven laminate counter that still worked fine. It just needed tending to. They walked the back property trail through the birch trees with coffee on Saturday morning and didn't talk the whole time, just walked, which turned out to be exactly what both of them needed. On Sunday afternoon, Meredith sat on the front porch and said, "You seem like yourself." Harper sat next to her. The lake was doing the October version of what it always did, gray and silver now, the trees around it stripped and stark, the light lower and more direct than summer. She'd been afraid she wouldn't love it in the off-season. It turned out she did. "I'm not sure what myself is exactly," Harper said. "I'm figuring it out." "That's what I mean," Meredith said. 6 months ago, you would have said you were fine." Harper thought about the number of times she'd said that. How automatic it had been. "I'm fine. I'm okay. It's fine." The conversational habit of a person who has learned that her discomfort is inconvenient to others. "I'm not fine," she said. "I'm genuinely okay, which is different. I'm also still working through a lot of things that don't have clean endings." Meredith nodded. "Does it feel like the right place to do that?" Harper looked at the lake. At the dock extending out over the gray water, the far end planks recently replaced by the contractor, solid now under the flat October sky. "Yeah," she said, "it does." They sat until the lights started to go. Dottie came over around 4 with soup. Of course she did. And the three of them ate in the kitchen at the uneven table. And Dottie told a story about her late husband that was funny and affectionate and a little sad all at the same time, the way all the best stories are. And they laughed in the way you laugh when you're genuinely in a warm room with people you trust, which is one of the things that makes life worth the difficulty of living it. After Dottie left and Meredith went to bed, Harper did what she'd been doing most nights. She sat at her father's desk with the filing cabinet beside her and worked through the things that needed working through. There was always something. The conservation zone application required a supporting letter. One of the monitoring sites needed its coordinates verified against the county survey map. A neighbor had questions about their property's relationship to the trust boundaries. She worked until 10. Then she put the papers away. She went to the kitchen, got a glass of water, stood at the window over the sink. The lake was barely visible in the dark, just the suggestion of it, the way darkness has texture when there's water beneath it. The dock was a shadow against the greater shadow of the night. Somewhere out on the water, something moved. She heard it rather than saw it. A brief disturbance, something living going about its business in the dark. She thought about her father standing at this window. Had he stood here at night, alone, looking at what he'd built and tended and protected? She thought he probably had. She thought he'd probably understood, in the quiet late-night way that people understand the things they can't say in daylight, that the lake would outlast him, and that the land would outlast him, and that the only thing he was really in charge of was the small, specific portion of its life that fell in his care while he was alive to tend it. She thought that was enough. She thought he'd thought so too. She put her glass in the sink, turned off the kitchen light. In the dark, she found the brass key on its hook by the back door. Held it for a moment. Put it back. She didn't need to hold it anymore. She knew where it was. She went to bed in the house her father built, with the lake outside in the dark, and the frogs going in the marsh, and the whole October night settling around the property like something that had been waiting to come home. She was not healed, exactly. She was not made new. She was a woman with a history and a filing cabinet full of her father's records and soft spots in her dock, and a list of things still to figure out that was longer than she found comfortable. She was a woman who had made mistakes and stayed too long and been smaller than she was, and had also, in the end, come back to herself in the only way that counted. Not triumphantly, not cleanly, but really. The frogs were going. They'd go until the first hard freeze. She pulled the quilt up and listened to them. The lake was right outside, doing what it always had, what it had been doing since long before her father planted his feet on this shore and decided this was where he'd make his stand. She closed her eyes. She was home.